What's up guys, Mike here, and today we are talking about a pretty grim subject, but it also is a topic I think is interesting to talk about in theory. Let's just pray to God this actually never happens. In this video, you are going to learn what would happen if an entire NBA team died. So the topic kind of explains itself here, which means let's just jump into this right away with the NBA's disaster draft rule. Yes, according to every source I could find on the internet currently, the NBA has a rule in place where, quote, a disaster occurs in which 5 or more players are dismembered. The league will hold a disaster draft to replace individuals who were lost. Teams unaffected by the disaster each would be allowed to protect 5 players. Now, to be clear before we go any further, yes, teams are only able to protect 5 players, but the team that was affected by the disaster would only be able to pick 1 player from a single roster. So right away, again, I do kind of feel just uncomfortable talking about this because it is such a morbid subject, but this is an NBA channel and I feel like I haven't been getting into NBA history enough lately, and I know a lot of you guys probably didn't know that this rule even existed. The reason for that is that the NBA keeps it kind of under wraps. I mean, in the current NBA rulebook, at least according to every Google search I could possibly think of to find this rule, there is no mention of a disaster draft. At least not recently, because I have found articles from 2001 which quote the actual rules that I already stated. Yes, there are more current articles that bring up this rule, but they are literally repeating word for word what Wikipedia says. So personally, I think the rule has not changed. I just don't think the NBA really wants to broadcast this because, I mean, again, very touchy subject. Looking at this actual rule though, doesn't it seem kind of ridiculous? And I'm not trying to be insensitive, but teams are only allowed to protect 5 players? I mean, if you really think about that, I'm almost positive that if a disaster draft happened to a team, they would be able to field a playoff team based on the players they could get. Just to give you 4 examples here, let's of course start with the Warriors, who have Steph, Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and Andre Iguodala. I mean, he's 35 years old, so they'd probably protect Kevin Looney or Jordan Bell, right? That means Iggy would be up for grabs, but I'm sure he'd be safe because DeMarcus Cousins would also be up for grabs. Steve Kerr himself has already said that Cousins is going to be out next season. They do not have enough money to pay him, so the Warriors aren't going to protect someone that's going to leave them, which means a team could get a potential franchise player. And sure, the Warriors are the Warriors, they are loaded, but just look at Boston. They're building a potential young dynasty right now, and if they could only keep 5 people, right now they have Kyrie Irving, Jason Tatum, Al Horford, Jaylen Brown, and Gordon Hayward. Those are their 5 absolute best players when healthy. Those are the 5 guys they need if they're going to make the NBA championship. Which means if they keep all 5 of those players, a disaster draft team could take Terry Rozier, Marcus Smart, Marcus Morris, any one of which would seriously hurt the Boston Celtics' future. In my opinion, the most flawed part about this draft is that it not only hurts the teams that are at the top, that I guess would make sense, but it also really hurts the teams that are rebuilding. Take my Chicago Bulls, for example. We have Lauri Markkanen, Zach LaVine, Wendell Carter, Chris Dunn, and would the Bulls keep Jabari Parker? That means that young guys like Bobby Portis, Chandler Hutchinson, and Antonio Blakely are just free to be picked. Again, those are guys that the Bulls are counting on to lead them into the future, and losing any of them would really hurt. The same could even be said about a team like the Knicks. They'd have to keep Kristaps Porzingis and Kevin Knox, but then they'd be put in a very tough place. I mean, right now, Enes Kanter and Tim Hardaway are 2 of their best players. If they locked into keeping those 2, that would mean that someone like Frank Ntilikina or Mitchell Robinson would almost definitely be selected. So while obviously, and again, I cannot stress this enough how much I'm trying to tread the line here and just talk about this rationally, but I haven't even gotten to the most ridiculous part of this rule. The fact that right there in that rule, it clearly says if a disaster occurs in which 5 or more players die or dismember. 5. That is the limit. To me, that obviously raises the question, what would happen if something like 5 of the Golden State Warriors bench players passed away? Would they really get to do a disaster draft and draft from other teams around the league? I'm pretty sure if that actually happened, fans would riot, but again, because death is just such a taboo subject and because people feel very uncomfortable about it, I'm really not sure what would happen if the Warriors lost 5 players and that is the rule in place right now. And And going even further with why I think this rule is pretty extreme, when you combine the fact that 5 players specifically activates this draft, isn't it strange that the NBA's expansion draft for the Charlotte Bobcats was not nearly this valuable? Because in 2004, when the Charlotte Bobcats were formed, every single one of the other NBA teams was allowed to protect 8 players. That is a drastic difference. And yes, the Charlotte Bobcats were given the number 4 overall pick in the 2004 draft, which they later traded for the number 2 pick. But I mean, clearly the disaster draft would field a way better roster. Luckily though, an NBA disaster like this has never happened. That doesn't mean it won't happen. Life can suck sometimes, but hopefully with the advances to modern technology, teams will be safe. In fact, the only team in NBA history that really came close to losing their roster was the 1960 Minneapolis Lakers. Now, if you looked at my pinned comment on this video, you will see that I did make a video on this topic before, but it's no longer on my channel, and looking back at it, honestly, I really don't think I did a good job. I was very new at YouTube at the time. I mean, I did my best, but I think that this video, which was way more of a discussion of what would happen if this kind of tragedy occurred, is just a better video overall. With that said though, I do still have the story of the 1960 Minneapolis Lakers. It is actually very interesting, and so I'm going to leave you guys with that story. I did completely re-edit the audio and made it way better, and there are new clips and everything. So even if you were one of the people that saw it, I don't know, 2 to 3 years ago, you've probably forgotten most of the details, and I think you'll find it worth the watch anyway. And instead of doing my usual self-promotion, let's do something good here. I'm leaving a link down below to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Whatever money I make on this video, I will be personally donating to that cause. So if you guys have a few extra dollars to spare, they are a top-rated charity, and your contribution is going to help to save lives. Personally, I think that's pretty awesome. So yeah, donate if you can, and here is the Minneapolis Lakers story. On January 18th, 1960, the Minneapolis Lakers lost to the Hawks in St. Louis and prepared to board a plane back to Minneapolis. As the takeoff approached, a light snowfall began. Around this time, Lakers player Jim Krebs, in a scene that seems like it may have been a future inspiration for Final Destination, pulled out his Ouija board and predicted that the Lakers plane would have an accident. He urged members of the team not to board, but no one listened. At the time of takeoff, the plane held 10 Lakers players as well as staff members and family of the players and staff. The pilots were retired Lieutenant Vernon Ullman and Howard Guilford, 2 men who would soon become heroes, because soon after takeoff, the light snowfall had become a blizzard. Now remember, this is a private plane in 1960. It was nowhere near as equipped as a modern plane would be to handle this situation. And so, according to Elgin Baylor, here's what happened next. We were playing cards and then the lights went out and it got cold. And for a while, the pilot didn't say anything. And finally, everybody wanted to know what was going on, and he said the only thing that was working was the generator, not the instrument panel, nothing. They couldn't see anything. Yes, the horrible weather shut down the plane's navigation system, so they had to rise higher in the air and use a compass to determine where they were going. After a while though, even the compass failed, which meant that the pilots had to rely on celestial navigation. The situation was dire, and it got even worse. The plane's windshield wipers failed, so Ullman had to reach out the plane's window and wipe the snow off the plane's windshield himself. He ended up with frostbite on his hand and half of his face. It was at this time the pilots decided that they needed to land, and fast. In order to determine a spot to land, the plane had to fly low to the ground to use headlights from cars as a navigation method. Various sources experiencing this said at times the plane had to swerve upward to avoid the ground and even an 18-wheeler. But still, somehow, the pilots found a perfect cornfield to land in. And they did it. In the middle of a blizzard, Ullman and Guilford landed the plane in a cornfield, saving everybody's life on board. As they got off the plane, they were greeted by the town's undertaker, who said, "Thought I had some business tonight, boys."